Dishonest manager, found in Luke 16, verses 1 through 13. Hopefully you found your way there now. And so I want to invite you, if you're able, to stand together as I read for us this passage. We stand out of reverence for the word of God. This is not the word of man, and this is what God says. Luke 16, beginning in verse 1. He, Jesus, also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you no longer can be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take out your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take out your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." You would pray with me. Father, as we come to your word this morning, I pray that we would indeed receive it, that we would hear it, that we would take it to heart. This is not the clearest of all parables. There can be various understandings, interpretations, but we're not concerned about how many there are. We're concerned about which one is right. And I pray, God, that you might help us to understand rightly what your word teaches us this morning, and that we might then apply it to our lives in obedience and in faith. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. You may be seated. On November 15th, 1903, a young Italian immigrant named Carlo arrived in Boston with $2.50 in his pocket. Now, he started his journey with much more than that, but he gambled away nearly his entire life savings on that trip. But he wasn't so concerned about that. It didn't disparage him, because as he would later tell a reporter of the New York Times, "I landed in this country with $2.50 in cash and $1 million in hopes. And those hopes never left me." It would be those hopes that would drive Carlo to learn English as quickly as he could, to take on various jobs until he was able to establish himself as a businessman, as an investor. And while he really had no investment skills at all, he was able to start a company that within a year was bringing in $1 million a day. About $20 million a day in our economy today. How was a man with no investment skills able to do this? Well, it was a scheme. It turned into a scam. He would take the money that came in, and he would promise people when they invested that he could double their money within 90 days. Now, this was in an economy when banks were paying about 5% a year, and so people flocked to him, and he quickly began to pay them these dividends. He was able to do it because so much money was coming in. He would take the new money, he would pay out the old investors who eventually saw those returns and just kept reinvesting their money. And so millions upon millions upon millions came into his pockets. Carlo, who would then go by the name Charles, continued in this scheme for quite some time until newspapers in the area became curious. And then that curiosity spread to the bank examiners. And then one day they demanded an account. They wanted to see the books. They wanted to see the ledgers. And while Charles tried to hide what he had been doing for some time, eventually Charles Ponzi went to federal prison for defrauding his investors of millions upon millions. And his name was cemented in history as the namesake of the Ponzi scheme. Well, as we come to Luke chapter 16, Jesus is continuing to teach us through parables. Again, parables are stories. These are not historical accounts, but they are stories that Jesus tells about earthly things to teach an eternal reality. And now, after teaching a series of parables on lostness and the rejoicing that takes place in heaven when one is found, he now turns to the disciples and teaches them through a parable about a Ponzi, about a dishonest manager who apparently was living such a lavish lifestyle that his defrauding of his master becomes evident to the point that an account is asked for. He wants to see the books. He wants to see the ledger. In fact, he's going to fire this manager because of his dishonesty and whatever scheme it was he was putting together. Now, as we approach this parable this morning, I do want to say up front, this parable is a bit harder to understand than many of the parables that Jesus teaches. Just as last Lord's Day we saw in Luke 15 that the parable of the prodigal son is Jesus' longest parable, the parable of the dishonest manager that follows it is one of his hardest parables. I read in my studies this week no less than 12 different interpretations of this parable. I found myself scratching my head on the good side and trying to figure this out. And I was comforted as I came across the words of J.C. Ryle, who said this of this parable. He said, "This passage we have now read is a difficult one. There are knots in it which perhaps will never be untied until the Lord comes again." And there are certainly knots here. And while we may not perfectly untie all of them, I do want to try in our time this morning to untie some of them so that we might see, as those knots are untied, where the ends of that string connect and what it is Jesus is teaching, not just in this parable, but in these series of parables, what it is Christ is saying to his disciples in light of what he has been saying to the Pharisees and will say to the Pharisees. But in untying these knots, we have to be careful. Because as Ryle goes on to say, let us beware that we do not draw from these verses lessons which were never meant to be taught. And that's the danger with parables at times. We try to pull so much from them, we miss the point of what Jesus was saying. And in his kindness to us, Jesus so often in the parables, he tells the story and then he makes the point. And he does that here. And in verses 10 and following, Jesus tells us, here's what I want you to understand. Here are the knots untied. Here's the string laid before you. Here is the point. And so we're going to walk through this parable in light of these points that Jesus makes. And so you'll notice that in your outline as we look to the first point, a lesson on faithfulness. Jesus here is teaching us about faithfulness. He teaches it through the majority of the parable, and then he teaches it in the point of the parable in verse 10. Which again, Jesus says, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. And so if we're not faithful in the little things, we won't be faithful in the great things. We start faithfulness small, and then it carries over. I was thinking this not long ago. I read the story of a Senate chaplain who years ago was in D.C. and he was meeting with a senator for prayer, and the senator said to him, if you would just pray for me. I've really been struggling to give to God as I should. I've been struggling to tithe. When we were young and starting out, we didn't have very much. We didn't seem to have a problem with that. But now I make a lot more money, and I'm really struggling with it. And so this chaplain prayed to, dear God, lower this man's salary so that he can be faithful once again and give. Well, the reality is, if we are faithful in little, we tend to be faithful in much. That there doesn't just come this point in our lives where we reach a level in income or in salary when, okay, now we can be faithful to the Lord. It starts with whatever we have, whether it's $2.50 or it's $250,000. If we're faithful in little, Jesus says we will be faithful in much. Well, how do we see that in the parable of the dishonest manager? Well, what we principally see is this man was not faithful. And in fact, there is a lesson about unfaithfulness here. So let's review again what Jesus says. He begins in verse 1 to tell us there was a rich man who placed a manager in charge of his assets. Essentially, in Jesus' day, what this meant was this rich man, that reference to rich man, when Jesus uses it, is usually someone quite wealthy. And this man, with all his wealth, had entrusted a manager to oversee his accounts. His accounts primarily, as we see in this parable, would have been his investments, which would have come through lending out his resources to others. And so he had great wealth, he had great resources. This manager was then in charge primarily of lending these things out to debtors, who then would have to pay them back with interest. This was his full-time job. He was to look after all that the rich man had, and he was to return to him a return on his investment. But as the title to the parable tells us, this was not a faithful man. This was a dishonest man. And so it seems rather than lending the master's resources, he was spending the master's resources. Rather than investing for returns, he was padding his own pockets, to the point that it became so evident that people start to look into him, they start to ask questions of him, which ultimately lead them at some point, verse 2, to go to the rich man and say, there's something going on here you need to look into. That this manager of yours is not above board. There's a scheme, there's a scam, there's something going on. He's not making you money, he's losing you money. Principally, he's spending your money. You need to demand an account. And so he calls in the manager. He demands an account. He goes ahead and lets him know that he will be managing his accounts no longer. But before he leaves, he needs to bring the books, and he needs to show the rich man, the master, what he has indeed lost, and what, if any, is left of the master's estate, his assets. And so, verses 3 through 7, the bulk then of this parable, Jesus tells us how this manager then begins to think ahead. Now, he hasn't had to think ahead yet. He's essentially been living day by day because he had no reason to worry about the future. He was the manager of the wealthiest man in town. He had at his disposal anything he ever wanted. Now, it wasn't his, but he was pretty good at spending other people's money. And so the time comes when you realize he's not going to have that anymore. And he's a very smart man. He realizes he's too old and weak to go out and work manual labor. And no one's going to entrust him with their assets and to manage their estates. He's too prideful to go out and beg. But here's what he decides he'll do. As he thinks of what is to come, he realizes, I'm going to need others to help me out. I'm going to need people who will provide me housing at their estate. I'm going to need people who will provide me food at their table. How can I endear myself and indebt others to me when I have nothing? And then he realizes he still has the rich man's books. And so he invites in the employer's debtors one by one. Jesus tells us of two. There were likely many others, but the two make the point clearly. The first one comes to him and he asks him, "What is it that you owe my master?" And the man says he owes him 100 measures of oil. Now in Jesus' day, a measure would have been 8 gallons. This likely would have been olive oil. It was traded as a commodity then. It's still traded as a commodity now. That means that this man would have borrowed from this master about 800 gallons of olive oil, which in that day would have been about 3 years of someone's annual salary. So you just figure out right now in your head, what do you make a year and multiply it by 3, and that's what this man owes. No small amount. He is indebted to this rich man. But then notice the scheme. The manager says, "Okay, quickly, take out your loan papers, and we're going to fix those real quick. And you don't owe my master 800 gallons anymore. I still have authority over his estate. I can still notarize and sign off on this. We're going to cut your debt in half. Now you owe 400 gallons. Write that down real quick, and I'll sign off on it." Why does he do this? Because, well, now this man's indebted to him. And now this man looks at him and says, "Well, you just let me know if you ever need anything." I mean, imagine if the bank were to call you today and you go and sit in the manager of the bank's office and they said, "Well, we got your mortgage papers here, Mr. Carwile. And listen, just real quick, I'm going to cut this in half. Just sign this." Would you ask many questions? He has the authority to do this. Now, this doesn't speak highly of these people who were indebted to the master, because there's a scheme going on with them as well. There's some dishonesty there too. They know what they really owe, but they want to pay as little as they can pay. So the second man does the same. He comes, he says, "What do you owe?" He says, "I owe 100 measures of wheat." And apparently it was going to cost more with him, because instead of cutting it in half, he says, "Well, let's just cut 20% off." That man's willing to take that deal. And so now that what would have been in his day 1,000 bushels of wheat is now 800 bushels of wheat, which, by the way, was about 8 years of salary. And so you can see what he's doing here. He's just cutting the debts down. So now these debtors, they're still indebted, but now they're indebted to him, that they're going to return the favor. Why? He is looking towards his future. And he's realizing his future is pretty bleak. And that if he can scratch their backs now, they're going to scratch his back later. He's concerned about his future. He's thinking ahead. He knows he's going to need help. He knows he's going to need a place to stay. He knows he's going to need food to eat. And so that's why he does this. But make no mistake about it, this is not a picture of faithfulness. This is a picture of unfaithfulness. He has been unfaithful to his employer. Now he's being more unfaithful to him. I mean, at least the employer had these bills of debt that he was rightfully owed. Well, now he's decreased that considerably. No telling how much by the time he was in meeting with all the debtors. And these debtors are unfaithful because they just go along with the scheme. He's not a faithful person. But he is a shrewd person. He is a cunning person. And that's what perhaps is surprising to us. We come to verse 8, and at this point, the master has become aware of what it is he is doing. Perhaps at this point, he's gone through and met with every debtor. He's got the books in front of him. He sits down before the master, and the master is a wise man and knows very quickly these books are cooked. But man, this guy's pretty smart. And so verse 8, he says, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. His faithfulness? Absolutely not. He wasn't faithful, but he was shrewd. He was cunning. In essence, on the way out the door, the master kind of gives him a nod. Says, man, you were pretty shrewd in how you dealt with this. You got this over on me. You took care of yourself. He wasn't faithful to the master. The debtors weren't faithful to the master, but this dishonest manager was faithful to himself. because he wasn't looking out for anybody else but himself. And he was faithful to himself. He made sure his needs would be met. So what do we learn from this? Certainly we don't take from this then, and I don't believe Jesus here is commending us here, just go be dishonest. But he makes the point following that in verse 8 of this. He says, continuing in verse 8, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. That this is one of those knots J.C. Ryle was talking about. The sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. What is Jesus saying? I believe what he's saying is this, is that there are a lot of dishonest managers. That there were in his day, thus the parable, and there are in our day. The Ponzi schemes didn't stop in the 1920s. They are alive and well today. In fact, one of the greatest Ponzi schemes in history took place just a few years ago. You saw it in the news headline. Bernie Madoff did essentially what Charles Ponzi did a century before, and people ate it up to the tune not of millions, but of $65 billion he defrauded investors of. Some of the most famous people in our day sunk most of what they had into his Ponzi scheme. There are no shortage of dishonest managers. There are no shortage of people who are shrewd and who are cunning and who will go to any length and be persistent in it to take your money and take my money. I mean, how often does your phone ring and it's an unknown caller at dinner time, and you know exactly what it is? It's a Ponzi scheme. It's a scam. And so, most of you just send it to voicemail. Some of us answer it and put the phone in front of our dog who pants and barks at it. But we know what it is. It's a scam. So why does it keep happening? Because somebody answers the phone and doesn't give it to their dog. Somebody answers the phone and says, oh, okay, a Nigerian prince wants to give me millions of dollars. Let me go get my Social Security card for you, and here's my bank information for you. Somebody does that. If they didn't do it, if no one ever responded, if there was no money to be made, we could eat dinner in bliss. The unknown caller ID would never come up. But there's money in it for those who are shrewd and those who are cunning and those who have schemes and those who run scams. And Jesus says, look how persistent they are in this. The sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So is Jesus here telling us to be shrewd and cunning and dishonest? I don't believe so at all, but I do think he's telling us to take notice in their persistence and their commitment. I mean, what is this dishonest manager commended for? He's looking ahead, he's looking to his future, and he is cunning and shrewd to ensure that his faithfulness to himself pays off in the end. Yet Jesus is giving us something in his word to be faithful to other than ourselves, isn't he? Because what does Christ say? In order to follow him, we need to deny ourselves. We're not committed to ourselves. We're not committed to our bottom line. We're committed to others. We're committed to eternal causes. We're committed to others going to eternity with us. And I think that's the connection here. I think as the knots are untied and the strings pulled out, that's what we begin to see. And that's where faithfulness comes in. Not just faithfulness, but point two, stewardship. Because that's what Jesus is teaching us. He's teaching us we need to be faithful to his cause. And to be faithful to his cause, we need to learn the lesson here on stewardship. And we see it there in verse 9 and in verses 11 and 12. Verse 9, Jesus says, as he's told this parable, And he's given us this difficult command there about shrewdness and sons of light. And then he says, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. That phrase there is just referring to things of this world, material things. It's not saying that we were schemers and scammers. It's just saying that there are things of this world that one day will no longer exist. Principally, all the stuff we have. That in the end, it will be gone. We do not take it with us. You've heard this saying, nobody shows up the graveside with a U-Haul behind the hearse. We leave this behind. And one day it's in a yard sale. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourself then by that stuff you have right now, this unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, and it will fail, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. And then further, he says in verse 11 and 12, if then you have not been faithful in all this unrighteous wealth, all this stuff you have, who's going to entrust to you true riches? Well, what are true riches? Eternal things. If you're not faithful with temporal things, who's going to entrust to you eternal things? If you've not been faithful in that which is another's, and make no mistake about it, everything we have is another's. It might have your name on it now. One day it will pass to another. If it's not gone before then, if another doesn't take it from you before then, who will give you that which is your own? Now, again, more not. Now we're getting into, into November Christmas lights, and you're trying to untangle stuff here. But let's try to untangle this a bit. And Jesus here is telling us a story about a man who's concerned about his future. And because he's concerned about his future, he hatches this scheme with his master's debtors so that he can secure for himself something in the future. He is leveraging all that he has in his possession, which really isn't his, it's his master's, but it's what he has the ability to work with. He's a steward over, and he's leveraging it to guarantee future security. But notice what Jesus says we are to do. In verse 9, he says, we are to make friends for ourselves. What is this man doing? He's making friends for himself. But here's the twist. We make friends of ourselves so that later we will be received into eternal dwellings. You see, there's a difference there. The dishonest manager is concerned about whose table am I going to eat at tomorrow. He's not concerned about eternity. But Jesus says we are to be principally concerned about eternity, and we are to be stewards in such a way that we leverage what we have now so that the results, the dividends, pay off in eternity. In fact, he says here, we are to use our earthly wealth, all we have, all that will be gone one day, in order to secure friendships with those who will welcome us into eternal dwellings. What does that mean? Well, first, I think he's saying, recognize that you're not going to take anything with you. 1 Timothy 6:7, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can't take anything out of the world, but we're not going to take it with us. But there's an element here where Jesus is saying, but you can send something ahead. If you were with us last Lord's Day, I kind of joked about, in reference to the prodigal son taking everything he had and leaving, having no plans of ever coming back because he took everything. I kind of joked about my kids when they've gone away to college. They take what looks to be everything, but it's really not everything because then their room's full of stuff, and then they come back and there's stuff everywhere. And wouldn't you know it, this week, the stuff started coming. It took a full vehicle just to get the deposit home. There's more to come. Because she's not home yet. A lot of her stuff's home, but she's not home. But she's coming. And I know she's coming because I walk into her room and I can't walk into her room. Because it's just stuff everywhere. In fact, when I showed up, I was the courier of the stuff. Nothing's in a box. That would make too much sense. I literally drove home from Campbellsville with one hand on a stack of 5,000 photos that seemed beside me so they wouldn't just fly away everywhere. And then As I'm unpacking stuff with Sandy, there's all these bags that have nothing in them, and scratching the good side of my head. Could have put the pictures in the bag. But anyways, why is all this stuff in my house? Because she's coming. The stuff has come ahead of her because she is coming. There is stuff that has been sent ahead because she's coming. Jesus, I think, here is making a point about us sending something ahead. About using that which we have, that which we are stewards over, not just to be concerned about what we're going to leave behind, which we are concerned about. We leave things behind. We're thankful for those who went before us, who left something behind so that maybe we got to start with a little bit more than $2.50 in our pockets. We're entrusted, we are stewards of things so that we can take care of those who come after us. But that should not be our principal function when it comes to stewardship. And for some of us, we're so concerned about where we're going to live and where the foods are going to come from and what we're going to leave behind that we just think about what we're going to leave behind, and we think very little and maybe not at all about what we're going to send ahead. And there, I think, comes an untied knot. That Jesus is challenging who here? His disciples. They left everything behind. And yet, whatever they have, he's saying to them, use for eternal gains. Make friends for yourselves. Well, let's just untie this a bit. There's connections here. Luke 14, the parable of the great banquet. What is Jesus saying there? He's saying to those who would do what the dishonest manager does here, who are just concerned about themselves and who's going to scratch their back, and they're going to invite these people to the party, because then when those people have the party, they're going to invite them to the party. They're just concerned about the here and the now, and they're going to give a favor so somebody can return a favor. And what does Jesus say to them? Stop it. Stop it. Go out and get who? The blind, the lame, the beggar. Somebody who can't repay you anything. Bring them to the table. What is Jesus saying there? He's speaking of eternal things. He's speaking of the kingdom. He's speaking of the gospel. He's speaking of the great banquet and a new heaven and a new earth. And he's saying, why don't you be a little bit more concerned about who's going to be at that table in eternity than what table you're going to eat at next week? And that's what the dishonest manager is concerned about here. That's what we see being spoken of in Luke 14. And then wouldn't you know it, right after that, what's Jesus talking about in Luke 15? Eternity. Now, a lost sheep, a lost coin, which point to what? To a lost son. And the reality is, as much as they may have grumbled about shepherds and women, there's still something there where the Pharisees would have said, well, a sheep's worth something. You don't want to lose a sheep. And money, a coin, even if that's worth something, but they didn't think the prodigal son was worth anything. They were just concerned with their tables here and now. What is Jesus saying? Look ahead. Send something ahead. And so then he comes to Luke 16. Here's a guy concerned with his future, but it's just his immediate future. What did Jesus say? We are to be concerned about eternal future. He's making friendships for himself now so that he'll have a table to eat at next week. Jesus says you need to make friendships now that are going to be affected in eternity, so that these people that you make friendships with now, that you invest in now, is going to pay eternal dividends, because when you make it to a new heaven and a new earth, they are going to be there welcoming you in. Who's going to be there to welcome us in? Those who have gone before us. And friends, Jesus has given us just the unique opportunity and privilege to be involved in who's going to go before us. I think as we untie these knots, I think the point that Jesus is making, the picture that he's painting here, is that as much as we focus on our 401ks and what we're going to leave behind, perhaps we need to take some of that attention and focus it on what we're going to send ahead. And whatever God has blessed us with, whatever's in our pockets, no matter how little or how much, we need to be faithful with it in such a way that we're sending something ahead. That we are living and giving in such a way that the gospel is being proclaimed. That we are leveraging our time, our abilities, and yes, our resources in such a way that there's a kingdom impact. But I think the reality that Jesus is pointing to in his day, and certainly the sad reality we see in our day, is that there are people who profess the name of Jesus, who God has blessed enormously. And they have business minds, and they're astute, and there's a level of shrewdness there where they know how to turn a legal right profit, and they know how to build up a company, and they know how to employ people and take care of them, and they know how to do all these earthly things, and yet they spend very little time leveraging those things for the kingdom. And that's not to say that money's bad. Money's not bad unless money's bad. And it's not the money that makes it good or bad. It's how we use it and how we view it, which is the final point here, a lesson on worship. No, not here. Jesus just says it and it's clear. Verse 13. No servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Jesus doesn't say, it's really difficult to serve God in money. It's a great challenge to serve God in money. No, not. It says it clear. No, you cannot serve God in money. And how do we know which one we're serving? Well, our faithfulness and our stewardship tell us. I can still remember decades ago, when my pastor in college, Stephen Davey, who discipled under that church and that ministry, as soon as I became a Christian, Sandy and I were there, he married us, and I remember him speaking to these things and saying that if you serve money, if you're devoted to money, then you'll just use God. But if you're devoted to God, if you serve God, you'll just use money. The problem isn't the money. The problem is our devotion. And so often, if we're honest, we find ourselves way too devoted to one and not the other. And that's where Jesus brings us all in. That's where he goes with this parable of the dishonest manager. What are you devoted to? Are you devoted so much to what you're going to leave behind that you have little to no thought about what you're sending ahead? Or are you so devoted to what you're going to send ahead that you look at what you have and you leverage every opportunity, every resource so that other people might hear the gospel and that banquet table will be filled? Charles Ponzi, I started with, I'll end with, he spent the last years of his life in poverty, but it wasn't just money he lost. He lost his health. He had a massive heart attack that left him essentially debilitated. He had no strength. And then the ongoing challenges of his health left him with no sight. He was blind. And then he had a brain hemorrhage and he was paralyzed. No money, no health, no family and friends. You read a story and you find that some of the first people he defrauded were his family and friends. And so when the bottom fell out, none of them wanted to have anything to do with him. No money, no health, no family, no friends. And then January 18th, 1949, no life. He died. He died in a hospital that was established for paupers. He didn't even have $2.50 to his name. He left nothing behind. He sent nothing ahead. And friends, don't think that you can't do the same thing. Because this world is so tempting. And these things are so enticing. And they will lure us into thinking, here's what's worth something. And in the end, it's worth nothing. God in his goodness holds up the gospel to us today. And he says, here is the treasure. Here is the goodness. Here is the value. Will we invest our lives in that which will never be lost? That, I believe, is the challenge for us from the parable of the dishonest manager. If you would pray with me.